All right, I think you'll find this one interesting. Eminent Technology has built planar magnetic speakers for several decades. Their designer, Bruce Thigpen, is an original thinker, and this is reflected in the design of the speakers. Having heard prior versions, I guessed that the latest version, the LFT-8c, might be interesting. And as it happens, the $5,600 per pair price tag falls nicely into my assignment to put together an attractive $15,000 system. I chose the NAD M23 V2 power amp with the new Purifi modules and the Wattson Madison streaming DAC preamp to go with the LFT-8c. The Wattson and the NAD are each priced at $5,000, so my total system fits within the plus or minus 10% rule we've set for this project. Total price is therefore $15,600. Let's see what the Eminent Technology speakers contribute. As I hinted, I'll cover the NAD amp and the Wattson control source in the next installment. The Eminent speakers, as you will see, deserve the focus of a complete rundown. Let's start with a product overview. The LFT-8c is a planar magnetic speaker from 180 Hz up to 20 kHz or more. The planar drivers are crossed over to a semi-dipole woofer system below 200 Hz. The speakers are 61 inches tall and 13 inches wide. Planar, or panel speakers, have several advantages. First, it may help to know that planar magnetic speakers consist of a thin diaphragm with wires bonded to it. An array of magnets is placed near the wires. As the audio signal flows through the wire and the diaphragm are caused to move because current in proximity to a magnetic field will be attracted or repelled depending on the direction of current flow. Why bother? Well, in principle, planar drivers are driven over their entire surface area. This sounds like a nice idea, but the panels tend to be big, and big, lightweight things have resonances, so it's unclear if this is a net gain. Maybe yes, maybe no. Eminent has taken the step of making the LFT-8c a push-pull design, which is a little different than normal, meaning that the magnets are placed on both sides of the panel, resulting in lower distortion. Possibly the bigger aspect of planar speakers is that they're often dipoles. This just means that the sound radiates equally to the front and the back of the speaker. The key result is that the front and rear radiation cancel out at the sides and top of the speaker. This is an important property because a dipole will have less interaction with the room, and room interactions are quantitatively the largest source of distortion in stereo reproduction. This lower interaction can improve both imaging and bass smoothness. The potential problem is that the same side and top cancellation effect gives a 6 dB per octave roll-off below a frequency controlled by the width of the speaker. That's typically a roll-off starting at several hundred hertz. Designers can compensate for this with various panel resonances to boost bass output, but often, eventually, there just isn't enough excursion as you go down in frequency and the bass rolls off. Eminent has chosen to build the panel section of the LFT-8c around a 42-inch by 4-inch mid-range panel running from 180 Hz up to 7 kHz. Above 7 kHz, there's a narrow planar tweeter. The surface area and baffle width means that the mid-range panel won't go sufficiently low for the LFT-8c to be full range with just 2 drivers. So, below 180 Hz, Eminent uses a quasi-dipole cone bass module. On board is an 8-inch front woofer and a 6.5-inch rear firing woofer. These run out of phase, so there's some dipole cancellation, but this is carefully controlled to allow good output down to below 30 Hz. The big point of the quasi-dipole alignment is to limit lateral output to reduce room modes and yield better bass definition. The woofer module has a built-in amplifier and DSP system. The mid-range and tweeter are driven by the user's power amp. The DSP allows time alignment of the drivers as well as providing some adjustments for bass, level, and frequency response. I was impressed with how well the woofer and mid-range tweeter were integrated. I'll say more about this in a moment, but if you think cone and planar speakers can't work together, you should hear the LFT-8c. As usual, execution matters at least as much as simplified theories. Probably more. The other thing to note is that the LFT-8c seems to have low sensitivity. It's rated at 83 dB for 1 watt at 1 meter with an 8 ohm impedance, which seems to be 4 to 5 dB lower than typical cone speakers. But line sources, and the LFT-8c is kind of a line source, reduce their output less as distance increases than cone speakers do. You don't listen at 1 meter, you probably listen more like 3 meters, so you're going to be farther from the speakers. So, despite the rating, the power needed for the LFT-8c is actually a little less than needed for a conventional speaker at 3 meters, all other things being equal. The NAD amp I've chosen for this system has 200 watts per channel into 8 ohms. That proved more than adequate for my 75 to 80 dB typical levels. All right, let's talk about sound quality. As always, my job is to objectively observe what a product does with reference to the absolute sound. Your job is to decide if the particular strengths of a product fit your sonic priorities based on musical preferences and environment, that is, room and ancillary gear. I want to start with a global observation. The LFT-8c is somewhere between surprising and stunning in terms of sound quality. It just sounds different than other $5,000 speakers I've heard. And there are several ways in which it just sounds better than other speakers in this price range. In fact, there are elements of the sound quality of the LFT-8c that are exceptional not only at this price point, though that's true, but in comparison with speakers at, say, 10x the price. The difference doesn't seem subtle to me. Let me enumerate what I'm talking about, and along the way, I'll also explain a few shortfalls. First, let's talk about transparency. And perhaps the standout quality of the LFT-8c is what is commonly called transparency in the audiophile world. The idea of transparency is to leverage a visual analogy. If you imagine looking through the windshield of your car at the outside world, you can easily think of how the glass might distort the image you see. The windshield might be dirty. That dirt level might vary as you drive along. The glass might be tinted. Reflections might block or alter the view in certain directions. We borrow this idea for describing certain patterns of distortion in audio gear. With the glass in your windshield, you know when it's clean and clear and when it's not. With audio gear, you know when it sounds like the instruments and voices are actually in your room and when you sense that there is something, or many somethings, between the performers on the recording and the sound you hear. The more the instruments and voices sound there and unfiltered, the more transparent we say the equipment is. It helps, of course, to have real instruments in real spaces as a reference for this. And as I said, this is what we call the absolute sound. But because you spend 16 hours a day in real space perceiving real sounds, everyone is actually pretty good at sensing transparency. As I said, the LFT-8c is exceptionally transparent. It presents voices and instruments more like they're in your room, unfiltered, than perhaps 90% of speakers can do. The technical trick here is to deliver the information supplied by the source and the amplification, but at the same time, not to enhance or exaggerate transients and tones. Errors of subtraction and addition are easily heard as errors. And since we generally like the music in the home to sound believably like the real thing, reducing those errors, as the LFT-8c does, is potentially important. Now, in our methodology, you decide how much you care about this. For reference, I sense that the LFT-8c goes a step beyond what electrostatic speakers do in the transparency department, especially in the mid-range and bass. Electrostats are impressively clear and dynamic, but this transparency often seems confined to a particular frequency band. That restriction is less evident with the LFT-8c. This, of course, is a big generalization, so take it as a comment on the excellence of the LFT-8c, not a rigorous statistical analysis of all electrostats. All right, next let's talk about imaging. The second standout quality of the LFT-8c is its imaging. In this area, we should first talk about sound staging, which you may recall is the ability of the equipment to place musicians believably on a virtual stage. The LFT-8c does this very well, with an excellent sense of positioning left and right and front to back. The granularity of the positioning is quite fine-grained, but not exaggerated. I do think the coherence of the sound staging, wherein performers do not consistently move forward when they are toward the left or right side of the stage, is bettered by a few speakers. But the LFT-8c is outstanding at this price. Still, at times, hard-panned performers seem to move to the surface of the speaker. That issue is somewhat compensated because the LFT-8c is championship level in presenting performers with a believable sense of air around them. This mostly means that the sense of size of the performers is not miniaturized, but seems proportional to real people and real listening positions. Doing this well is more rare than you might think. When we transition to the presentation of sound space, which is the sense that the equipment delivers of the scale of the stage and the hall in which the performance occurred, real or virtual, the LFT-8c does very well rendering a sense of soundstage height, a tricky task because height is not encoded per se by the stereo process. But the LFT-8c avoids the common problem of decapitating the soundstage at roughly the tops of the speakers, and those speakers are usually shorter than these are. The soundstage of the LFT-8c, in contrast, extends somewhat above the generous height of the speakers. In addition, the LFT-8c generates somewhat more hall sound than is typical, giving a good facsimile of what you might hear in a live performance. This, of course, varies from recording to recording, but I note that many recordings are somewhat more dead and less ambient than you would hear in a real performance. Part of this recording problem is because of close miking. In any event, the LFT-8c compensates with a believable sense of a sizable environment. Again, the opposite of the all-too-common miniaturization of imaging. Now let's cover bass performance. The next standout quality of the LFT-8c is the character of the bass. Ordinarily, I find that listeners are somewhat more concerned with bass output or balance than they are with bass character. This, I think, stems from the fact that 90% or more of bass in audio is delivered by monopole woofers, that is, cones in a box. Such woofers are omnidirectional at bass frequencies, and this means that longitudinal, lateral, and vertical modes in the room are all excited. The result is that with most speakers that audiophiles will have heard, there's some resonant smearing in the bass. The LFT-8c reduces this smearing by not being omnidirectional at low frequencies. Not omnidirectional. The result is simple. Bass seems better defined and more transparent. Drums or plucked bass have a definition and time signature that more closely match what you hear from real instruments. If you know the absolute sound, you will enjoy this difference, I think. Now, there's generally no free lunch in physics, so you can't make a quasi-dipole woofer with small cones that delivers high output at low frequencies. Eminent has chosen an interesting path here because in addition to doing dipole bass, which limits output, they also have made the LFT-8c deliver low bass. We measured good output down to 30 hertz at least, but going this low almost certainly points to another area where the LFT-8c may be limited. I didn't find this output limitation to be much of a problem in my listening, where I generally cap average levels at about 80 dB. But if you listen a lot louder than that, you might run out of headroom. Another element of the LFT-8c bass that I found praiseworthy is the ability to adjust the bass to fit your room. The fact that the bass here excites the room modes less than typical speakers is not the same as saying room modes are eliminated. So, Since the size and shape of your room will determine the frequencies and the grouping of modes, you might find a given bass output setting to deliver too much or too little bass. To address this, you simply turn a knob, which moves bass up or down in 0.1 dB steps below the 180 Hz crossover. Other bass parameters can be tweaked as well. I moved the bass up by 4 dB, which happened to align the bass level with the mid-range. Now note that again, turning the bass up implies some additional limitations to maximum output. Perhaps more important for some music, jazz, classical, folk, ambient, even classic rock, the quality of the bass on the LFT-8c means that you may not need as much level in order to be happy. Some people may respond to typical bass smearing by wanting to reduce bass level. This is what research says. But I find that most listeners respond by attempting to substitute quantity for quality. The LFT-8c and some other broadband dipoles, say the Linquist 521 or the Alcivox Michelangelo, bass quality is high, and I think some listeners will find that quality is its own satisfaction. As a result, they may not pine for more level. If, however, you're used to large-scale concert, metal, or rock, you may find that the bass level and output limitations of the LFT-8c fall short of your needs. Okay, now let's go on to dynamics. With all this possibly excessive talk about special cases of output limitations, let me make some comments about dynamics. Let's remember that the term dynamics refers to the contrast between low and high levels in the music and is not at all the same thing as high average level. First, perhaps because of its low general distortion, but also because it sounds so dynamically alive, I found I played the LFT-8c somewhat louder than normal for me, perhaps 78 dB instead of 75 dB average. Then, the LFT-8c is very satisfyingly revealing and punchy on, say, classic rock or symphonic music. And even on the latest Sleep Token album, which has its full-on metal moments, I thought the LFT-8c delivered a pretty darn good wall of sound experience at high levels. Eminent advises that the LFT-8c's output limitations are imposed by driver excursion limits, not by the risk of damage. Said differently, the LFT-8c just compresses output a bit when you get too loud. The speaker doesn't blow up. Eminent suggests the edge of the working envelope for the LFT-8c is a bit above 90 dB average. Considering that your ears start to physiologically protect themselves above about 85 dB, this limitation won't apply to all listeners by a long shot. Still, I think the big point here is that within its not very restrictive output limits, the LFT-8c sounds more dynamic than most speakers. This could be because it reaches down to low output levels so well. Remember, dynamics is the contrast between loud and soft. It could also be because the drivers are so-called fast. It could also be because of the lower resonant character of the bass. In any event, this property of the LFT-8c can be very engaging on music that needs it, which, frankly, is most interesting music. All right, now we come to everyone's favorite subject, voicing. We've already talked about bass, so I won't repeat myself, but bass is a factor in how you'll probably perceive any speaker, including the LFT-8c. Still, you have more control with this speaker than with 95% of what's on the market. There are two other elements of voicing that you may or may not enjoy. First up, the LFT-8c sounds slightly mid-range forward compared to the absolute sound. I think many of you would like the resulting clarity and tonality, but it's in contrast with the tendency of modern speaker designers to slightly depress some part of the mid-range. Second, I observed that the upper mid-range and lower treble of the LFT-8c can sound slightly thin. This seems to be the emphasis of harmonics over fundamentals, which alters the character of some instruments, violin and piano, for example. What is odd is that the LFT-8c doesn't sound particularly bright in the sense of edgy or dynamically exaggerated on good recordings, but it does ruthlessly reveal compressed and distorted recording production. If you like music that is produced to add waveform distortion to what the artist laid down in the studio, this may not bother you. And if you listen to well-made recordings, the slight tonal alteration may also not bother you. All right, some comparisons. I previously mentioned the Linkwitz LX521 and the Alcivox Michelangelo, which are significantly more expensive, but share some qualities of the LFT-8c. Closer to home, the LFT-8c has a voicing that contrasts interestingly with the excellent Per-Listen A3T, which I recently reviewed and is basically at the same price point. In that review, I offered a typology of 3 speaker design strategies: linear transparent, acoustic distortion reduction, and frequency shaping. Since the A3T falls in the frequency shaping category and the LFT-8c fits within the acoustic distortion reduction concept, you might expect these speakers to sound different. And they do. The A3T has more bass and less detailed bass. The treble of the LFT-8c is more prominent. The sound space rendering of the LFT-8c is even bigger. There are other differences, but as I said in the A3T review, it really helps to hear speakers from each category to decide which kind of complex multi-course meal you prefer. Thanksgiving dinner and omakase sushi can both be excellent, but they're hardly the same. In any event, the overall qualities of the LFT-8c are different. You may find that to be a pleasant surprise or an important drawback. All right, let me summarize. No product suits everyone, but the Eminent Technology LFT-8c does so many things differently for a reason, and it does them so well, I would classify it as a great speaker. Possibly the lowest cost speaker that could be considered great in the sense of sometimes producing a compelling facsimile of the absolute sound. You could easily prefer it to excellent speakers at 2x or maybe even 20x the price, which makes it a stunning value. You need to hear this one. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the Eminent Technology LFT-8c. If you have, we hope you come back, and we'll see you again soon.